Welcome everyone to Birmingham Tech Week. This is the second day in a series of events that are being put on to bring together the digital and tech community of the Midlands. But before we start, we're going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So just to let everybody know, when you've entered the room, you have been put on automatically on mute. That's just so that the person speaking, there's the best sound quality for everybody. We're also going to be doing a number of questions and polls throughout this this talk as well. So it's not just a talk. You're going to listen to my Scouse tones and Rob's Scottish twang. It's going to be a bit of an interactive session too. And finally, we do need to make you aware that this session is being recorded so that anybody who can't make the live session will actually still be able to take part and listen to the conversation. So before we get started, just a quick reference to all of the partners and sponsors who are associated with Birmingham Tech Week. So you can see them flashing up on your screen now. And if you do want to find out any more information about the partners, just visit the website and you can find loads of information there. So onto the main event. So our talk today is all around putting people at the heart of transformation. Now, Olivia, you're going to be running the kind of technical bit in the background. Do you want to give us a quick overview of what's going to happen from a polls and questions perspective?
Yes, so I'm launching a test poll for you now. So if you all could just try and see if you can see that on your screen. And if you can't see that for any reason, it means that you're using Zoom on your browser. So then whenever we read out a question, just put your comments in a chat box and you can take part that way. You can also see a quick Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So any questions, just put them in there and we'll read through, get back to you, or if we can, we'll get back to you after the session as well. So it looks like we have quite a few people able to vote. So I think we're all good to go.
Thanks, Liv.
Brilliant, that's great. Thank you, Olivia. And they're the results of the poll. So we'll be flashing up the results as we go through as well. So, you know, who are we? Who is Rob McCracken and Chris Finnegan? So I'm going to tell you a bit about myself and then I'm going to hand over to Rob. So my name's Chris and I've worked with Curium Solutions for around 5 years now in the management consultancy space. You know, I've spent most of my career in change management and driving change. Some of the people I've worked with before Curium are brands like Very and Littlewoods, where I was with that company, Shop Direct, for the best part of a decade and helped them right through the transformation from being a catalogue retailer into where they are today, which is, you know, one of the premier shopping destinations in the UK with a digital department store. I was also heading up the transformation agenda at Wren and took them from a challenger brand, a small entry into the market, to where they are today, which is the #1 kitchen retailer in the UK. And also set up a company called Miss Pat for Success. So took them again from a small brand right through into, you know, a fully fledged e-commerce business that was then acquired by Boohoo. So lots of experience there, mostly in retail. Hopefully that gives me a little bit of credibility that I know what I'm going to be talking about. Over to Rob, do you want to give us a quick flavour of yourself?
Yeah, and I'm Rob McCracken. So I've worked with Curium for about 6 years now, and I've been involved with change ever since I left uni. I've worked for a large number of organisations, helping deliver regulatory change, system change, and launching new products. Did all of those types of things at Eon. To helping deliver ERPs in places like Staffordshire County Council and WaterLogic more recently, where I helped launch a new solution in Australia, all remotely because of COVID. So hopefully, again, I've got some chops here to help talk through how you can do some of these people-related activities digitally rather than face-to-face.
Brilliant. Cheers, Rob. Okay, so a little bit about what Curium does, and I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. So if everyone can close your eyes, I'm going to just talk you through a little story about how we see change to be different to business transformation. So imagine you are on a leisurely stroll along a nice meadow, and you are strolling with a great mountaineer who has done some treacherous peaks in his past. So he can scale any mountain and he can climb any kind of, any peak in the world. Now, when you're on that sunlit meadow, you might not really notice that he's very different to you. Maybe the way he packed his case for the day was slightly different. Maybe he's a bit more cautious about the steps that he takes. But ultimately, it's hard to see what makes him really exceptional because you're on a nice sunlit meadow. Now, in contrast, let's envisage that you are on the side of Mount Everest with this very same climber. So there is a storm going, snow is hitting you in the face, the wind is blowing you. In this environment, you would absolutely see what makes this person great. And that is kind of the metaphor that we use for business transformation. So where we play as an organization is we see a kind of change as a scale of complexity. Down one end of the scale, you've got your business as usual change, which is low to medium complexity. And most companies can do this on their own. It just requires effort, dedication, but it doesn't really require an expertise to deliver BAU change. And we might support organizations in getting better at that, but typically organizations do that themselves. Now, right down the other end of the spectrum is where you're looking at business turnaround. So the kind of slash and burn to save a business. If a business is massively failing, you might have to cut departments, restructure, do things that really change the business in order to stay alive. And we don't typically operate in that space either. Where we operate is in the middle. So business transformation, where there is a complex change that is being driven by either a great opportunity or a real threat. And that's where we operate with businesses and support them with an expertise to try and make that change a reality and bring it about in the fastest and most effective way. And we do that with 3 brand promises. So we always have a people first approach, we always keep things simple, and we always make it real. And we genuinely believe that true business transformation can only happen when these 2 things on the screen combine. So on the right-hand side of the screen is what we call transformation services. And this is all around your project management, your program management, ultimately about building and changing things, tangible things. And on the left-hand side, there's our people solutions, which is all around changing mindset and behaviours. So things like leadership development or coaching falls into that arena. And we genuinely do believe that business transformation has to have both of those elements in order to really make it a success and make it sustain that change. So that's a little bit about us and Curium and our background and what we do. I'm going to hand over to Rob now to give us a real kind of fast look at the rise of digital throughout the previous decade, well, the previous century, really. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, so now you know a bit more about us and what we do. We're going to talk you through from the 1930s all the way up to today. Why? Well, because not only is digital now embedded in every aspect of our lives, every transformation has a digital element too. And with ever increasing disruption, businesses are really trying to evolve to keep up with our customer demands. And this has only been accelerated in the last 6 or 7 months with COVID. So who would have thought when we were doing our New Year's resolutions that we could have achieved so much in the digital space this year? So mobilising remote workforces, delivering projects remotely without ever seeing the end users in the flesh. All of this in the last 6 months. We've probably jumped on a decade in the digital space in that time. So with all of that, the new normal is today. Our technology is ready for it. But the key question is, are our people? And if they aren't, well, what can we do to help them on the journey? So we hope our session plants some seeds that you can reap in the weeks and months to come. But I'm just going to dive into starting in the 1930s. So as a kid, I assumed the BBC computer that I used at school was the oldest one ever. But in reality, the first one was created by a German in 1935. He was called Konrad Zuse. It's the guy on the slide. It was his 3rd attempt. He was dedicated. He showed great perseverance over 6 years that it took to get his technology working. Now, unfortunately, when he tried to bring others into his vision and get funding from his government to take it the next step, he failed. So even in the early 1930s, the very first digital transformation was failing. But it wasn't because of the technology, it wasn't because of the individual's dedication, but it was because the decision makers weren't aware of the potential and they weren't willing to take that risk. So if we fast forward to the 1990s, we find the beginnings of the internet. So in 91, Tim Berners-Lee, again, the gent on the slide, published the first ever website, which basically described what the World Wide Web project was and how others could use it. And then a few years later, in late April 93, he then released his source code so that everyone could use it, and that was called Mesh. Now, the World Wide Web, which it was later dubbed, became the first royalty-free, easy-to-use means of browsing this information network. And that's basically what the internet's become today. Now, you might think that this transformation was an overnight success, but it wasn't. Whilst there wasn't active resistance to the change like there was in the previous example, the resistance was there in the form of apathy, with many industry experts labeling it vague but exciting. So bringing ourselves up to 2015, digital transformation is forcing companies to change their business models. Now, what's really interesting about this stage of the digital evolution is it's not companies that are driving it, it's their customers. They now expect content relevant to them and what they're doing anytime, anywhere, on any device. The key part here is it's their journey that's important, not yours. Now, fortunately, most organizations are now aware of the potential of technology, and they've certainly got the desire to use it to put their customers first to protect their market share. And that can be evidenced by the $1 trillion that was spent in 2018 on digital transformation. So the question is this, with technology being widely available, and with established players having the most resources able to invest, you'd think that you'd expect them to be the ones to continue to dominate. You'd have very few new entrants entering the fray. But we know that wasn't the case. So what made the difference for these new market entrants like Netflix, Uber? Well, the one thing that those larger companies couldn't ever replicate, their people and their culture. So we're now up to date. We're now looking forward. What's next? Well, it's predicted that apps, AI, and bots will become ever more embedded in our daily lives. So Alexa and Siri, two great examples. Both have become really popular ways to speed up how you find information on the internet, all by using your voice. Well, if they can understand your accent, of course. Chris and I have a bit of a struggle with that one at times. But utilizing AI and repeat process automation, Alexa and Siri are really embedding that digitalization into our everyday. And they'll soon go even further than just finding your favorite restaurant. They'll also go to the trouble of booking it for you, just with a verbal command. Now, you may assume that RPA and AI are threats to people. And we recognize that that could be the case. Hence the importance of providing clarity and vision and engaging not only your teams, but your customers on their journey to their use. If deployed correctly, they'll be viewed as an asset, removing all the thousands of hours of tedious work and providing capacity to help focus on value add, the stuff that we all find far more interesting. But if deployed badly, well, you're probably going to lose your most important assets, and that's your people. So far, I've given you a quick whistle-stop tour of digital from the 30s up to today, but I'm going to dive into a few examples where specific organizations have succeeded, and unfortunately, a few have failed. So the first one we're going to talk about is Blockbuster. So you might remember in the good old days, physically going into a video store, walking around, choosing your movie, and if you were really lucky, you could even get some popcorn and sweets. Certainly brings back some amazing memories for me as a kid. Now, the first Blockbuster opened in 1985, a year before I was born in Texas. And within the first 8 years, it had grown to being $1 billion business, had over 3,500 stores worldwide. And a key component of the strategy at the time was to diversify. And that was to help protect itself from competition. It would continually scour the market for threats and opportunities. And in 2000, one of those opportunities emerged to be able to acquire a competitor for only $50 million. Bear in mind, it's $1 billion business. However, they turned that opportunity down. Now, who was that competitor? It was Netflix. So instead of buying Netflix, Blockbuster decided that it was going to launch its own video on demand service. However, does anybody actually remember what it was called? No? Well, that's because they chose not to launch it. Instead, they focused fully on their retail video store model. And by 2013, they'd gone bankrupt. So Blockbuster had the ideas, they had the technology, they certainly had the money to keep ahead of their competitors. But the desire to protect what they had really stifled innovation. And it meant their staff and their customers' thoughts basically fell on deaf ears. Both of which, I believe, have ultimately contributed to their downfall. So before we move on to the next company, Olivia is going to pop up a quick poll for us to ask you a quick question. So the question is, the company I'm about to go on to, which is in the photography sector, developed the first digital camera in 1975. But who was it? Was it Canon, Fujitsu, Kodak, or IBM? Ah, you all know your history. Well done, guys. You're right. It is Kodak. So whilst Blockbuster didn't keep up with changing customer expectations and demands, Kodak really clutched defeat from the jaws of victory because they ultimately created and invented the technology that eroded their market share so significantly. So the gent that's shown on this slide is a guy called Steve Sasson. He was basically the Kodak engineer who invented the first digital camera. And when he was proud as punch, showcasing his achievement to the Kodak management, they called his invention cute and basically said, don't tell anybody about it. So instead of embracing the need to change and the new technology that was available, they dropped it. Now, they dropped out of fear. The fear was that it would cannibalize their photographic film business. If only they'd used their clairvoyance to their benefit. So since this decision, Kodak, which was about 130 years old, it had grown to be another $1 billion business. It had well over 100,000 employees at its peak. It even coined the iconic Kodak moment tagline and had the first camera on the moon. But from that point, it had decades of decline, all caused by digital photography. And in 2000s, they had a golden chance to help correct that course. Unfortunately, though, another correction that they didn't take. So before Facebook, where it was even an idea in Zuckerberg's mind, Kodak acquired a photo sharing site called Ofto. So as you'd expect, they rebranded it. They called it the catchy Easy Share Gallery. Its main purpose? To print more photos. So as you'd imagine, it just didn't shore up their market share. Now let's look at it in a different way, alternate reality, where Kodak truly embraced its own mission of sharing memories and sharing life. In this reality, they rebranded Ofto Kodak Moments, and they turned it into a life networking site where people could share pictures and personal updates. Perhaps in that reality, they wouldn't have needed to sell the site for $25 million only 11 years on. The same year where Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion. So what's the key learning from this story? Well, Kodak did end up creating digital cameras, albeit a bit later than competitors. They did invest in technology. They even understood that photos would be stored online. Where they failed was that they didn't understand that online photo sharing would require a whole new way of thinking, and with it, potentially new resources. Their culture held them back from innovating and disrupting themselves before the competition got a chance. And I find Kodak's story really quite sad. It's a story of potential lost, and especially for a company that's done so much for how we can see the world today. But it is a really great example of where culture can stifle progress. But rather than focusing on the negatives and the examples where it hasn't worked, well, let's look to the examples where it has. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Lego. Love Lego. After a 20-year period of growth up until 91, Lego started to suffer a decline. That decline in revenue was caused competitors were producing similar products at a fraction of the cost. And by 2004, they were so close to bankruptcy. But at that pivotal point, they chose to embark on a change in direction, to fundamentally shift their culture and their mindset. Part of this change was to become far more customer-centric and innovation-led, and resulted in the business restructuring. They launched a digital transformation program that focused on new revenue sources coming from movies, mobile games, and apps. This transformation proved hugely successful. So the first movie, the Lego movie, made over $400 million in revenue from an investment of 60 million. So as their devilishly catchy theme tune from the movie would tell us, everything was awesome for one of our childhood favourite toys. Now the change in direction was starting to bear fruit, but rather than resting on their laurels, they doubled down. Backed by that initial success, innovations were actively encouraged from both their employees and their customers. They even went as far as to hand their design capabilities to the fans. And they launched a web-based 3D digital designer tool, which basically gave fans the opportunity to create and then vote on new designs. So what does this show restore? Well, it shows that you're not always going to win. Every day isn't going to be better than the last. But if you invest in clarity of vision, you trust your team, and you create the right environment, your people are probably going to dig you out of most holes. So moving on to our final success story. We've talked about the demise of Blockbuster. Let's now take a dive into Netflix, the company that they chose not to invest in all those years ago. So again, Olivia is going to pop up a quick poll for us. And the question she's going to ask us before we dive in is, what percentage of the world's broadband do you think is used by Netflix today? Is it 1%, 3%, 10%, or 15%? And the answer is, oh, close but no cigar, guys. It's actually 15%. So it just shows you how much the company set up in California only 20 years ago has come. It's massive. So did you know that when the business was initially set up, it only offered DVDs to rent? So you would go into their website, you'd order their movies, and you get it in the post. When you finished, you'd put it back in its envelope, send it back. And you could keep the DVDs for as long as you want, but you had to return it before ordering another. Unlike other providers as well, there were no late fees for late return. So 2 years after they'd started with this model, and as the business began to grow, they moved to a subscriber model, where subscribers could receive unlimited DVDs for one monthly price. The year after that, in 2000, Netflix was already offering personalized movie recommendations. In 2007, the next shift came where they started to stream videos. And over the decades since then, Netflix have partnered with numerous organizations to allow streaming on other platforms like the Xbox and the PlayStation. And if you're lucky, you can even now watch it on the screen of your Tesla. I just suggest you park it first. So in only 10 years, they had gone through numerous transformations to their business model. But yet the biggest was yet to come, when they started creating their own content as well as distributing it, all in response to the other distributors hoarding their content on their own new platforms like Disney+, HBO Max, places like that. So as you can tell, Netflix continually pivot to new markets and ideas, all in their ambition to grow. But what's driving that success and continual push? Well, in my opinion, again, it's their people focus. Netflix has a core philosophy of people over process. Now, that isn't to devalue process, but instead to increase the value of people. And if you're interested to find out more about their culture deck, it's publicly available on their website. So after this session, of course, nip over and have a look at it. But one of the key things that I took out of the review that I looked at were two things: radical honesty and disagreeing openly. Radical honesty is basically where employees evaluate one another and are encouraged to weigh in on strategic decisions in the aim to create the dream team. And disagreeing openly, so that's that they can get the best decisions possible, and they have informed captains who listen to the debates and then ultimately make the decision. But there's the expectation that even if you did disagree, you're going to help to make that idea a success. Now, both concepts are utopian, right? I would love to be in an organisation where those things happened well. But if they're executed badly, it could be catastrophic. The difference between success and failure with those two concepts are a really fine line. But it's a fine line that we believe everyone can tread if you embrace diversity and you understand differences in your team members. So with that, we're going to turn to our final part of the session, where we're going to go through three things. The first is teamship, which will see us focusing on understanding your team, understanding them better, so you can improve your effectiveness as a group. The second is on capability, which focuses on what you can do to help support your individuals on their respective change journeys. Then the third is resistance, which is going to focus on how you can increase your chance of success in embedding and sustaining the change you're looking for. So I'm going to hand you back over to Chris, who's going to talk through the first of those three, teamship.
Okay, so I'm going to kick this session off with a short video clip, which is only about 20 seconds. So let's just watch this clip and then I'll explain why I've chosen this one. Okay, so that was what is called a murmuration of starlings. So it's this flock of starlings moving in harmony, all moving together. You know, it's an amazing thing to watch. I don't know if anyone's seen one in real life, but it's almost as if they are moving as one. So there's thousands of starlings in that flock, but they all seem to move in line with each other, in harmony, and really understand each other. Now, do our teams typically work like that? Does everybody work in harmony? And I think sadly, the answer is no. You know, often people aren't working in harmony. Often they're, you know, if we compare it to the flock of starlings, people would be crashing into each other, banging. We might have some, you know, casualties, people falling from the sky, because it's just not working in harmony. So I'm going to ask a question now, and Olivia's going to again put it up on the screen. So it's a really, really simple question. Do you trust yourself? So just have a think about that question for a second. Do you trust yourself? And then cast your vote. Is it a yes or is it a no? So let's give everyone a couple of seconds to answer that question. And then Olivia, let's get those scores up on the screen. Okay, so we've got 83% of people are saying that they trust themselves, which is really, really interesting. So what I'm now going to do is give you a definition of trust. And then we're going to ask that question again and see if our scores maybe change. So let me define trust as every time you make a promise to yourself or to somebody else, you follow through on it. So I'm talking about every time you said you were going to go to the gym, every time you said you might not eat that bar of chocolate, every time you said you're going to mow the grass, you know, every time you promised other people or yourself that you were going to do those things, did you do it? So using that definition of trust, let's flash the question up again, Olivia, and let's see if anyone maybe has changed their opinion. So do you trust yourself? Yes or no? Okay, what's the scores, Olivia? Okay, so quite a change. It's actually an exact reversal of the scores. Interestingly, 17% of people still say they absolutely do trust themselves, even in light of that definition, which is interesting in itself. Thanks, Olivia. So I'm going to tell you a little story. So you might see on the screen, there is a picture of a marathon. I actually ran a marathon 2 years ago, the Chester Marathon, you know, being a northerner. And if anyone has done any running, if anyone in the audience is sitting there thinking, I know I'm a runner, I do marathons, you'll know that the key to being a successful marathon runner is to have a good plan, a good training plan. But within that plan, the critical run once a week that you usually do is called your long run. So you might do small runs through the week, but your long run is the critical one. And it's that run that gives you the muscle memory. You know, it really kind of builds up your endurance, your stamina. And that's what gives you the ability to run the incredibly long distance of a marathon. Now, every Saturday, I promised myself I was going to get up at 6 a.m. and do my long run of the week. Now, obviously, I've got loads going on in my life at the same time. I've got work, I've got friends, I've got family. You know, I even moved house during this period of training for a marathon. Now, what do you think happened most Saturday mornings when my alarm went off at 6 a.m.? I hit the snooze button, right? So most mornings, I would hit the snooze and I'd be lying there in bed in the dark thinking, get up, Chris, get up, go and do your run. And I wouldn't. And I'd lie there until my alarm went off again. And what do you reckon I did when it went off again? I hit snooze again. And this would repeat and repeat until ultimately I'd be lying there in bed and I'd be wide awake. And then I'd start rationalizing why I shouldn't do this run. I'd maybe say, well, it's still dark outside, you know, it's been raining. What if I slip and then I won't be able to do the marathon at all? And I've told all these people I'm doing it, and people have even sponsored me. You know, it's probably best that I don't actually even go out. So I talk myself out of it. And most Saturday mornings, what happens is I get up and make a bacon butty and don't do it. That's the reality of the situation. Now, in that situation, do I still trust myself? I probably do. Because even though I've made a promise to myself, even though I haven't done it, I still know I'm trustworthy. I'm still a good person. I follow through on most things. I probably didn't need to do that run. You know, it certainly killed me when I did the marathon, but I didn't need to do it in that moment. So I still trust myself. But let me introduce a new character to this story. So let's say I have a running partner called Tom, and I meet Tom every Saturday morning, or at least I'm supposed to, at 6 a.m. Now, do you think Tom would be as lenient with me as I am with myself? Or do you think Tom would just jump to the conclusion that I'm not a trustworthy person? Now, on the screen is a quote by a guy called Stephen Covey. Some of you may have heard that name because he had a really famous dad who wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Effective Leaders. And so he had a lot to live up to if his dad wrote a really successful book that sold millions of copies. But Stephen Covey Jr. actually he investigated trust. He was obsessed with trust, understanding what trust is, how it plays out in relationships, in workplaces. He really wanted to get under the skin of trust. And the statement on the screen summarizes everything that he investigated. So we judge ourselves by our intentions, but others by their behavior. So just take a moment to let that sink in. Our behaviors are the only thing that people will judge us on. Nobody knows what's going on up here. Nobody knows that I talked myself out of that run, that I weighed up the risk of going out in the dark and the wet. All people can see is the outcome, the behavior that I display. So the point is, if we could understand people's intentions more than just judging their behaviors, maybe we could interpret their behaviors in a different way, right? So on the screen, you've got 3 behavioral profiling tools. Some of them you may have heard of, some of them you may not have. So on the left-hand side is MBTI, which some of you may have heard as Myers-Briggs, which is a tool which can help you understand behaviors. In the middle is DISC, which again is another tool. And on the right-hand side is code, which is our own internally developed behavioural profiling tool at Curium. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about code because it's the one I know the most about. But ultimately, code is a way to look at behaviours through different lenses and to be able to understand what is driving that behaviour. Now, it understands that everyone is unique. Everybody has a completely unique behavioural makeup, and what drives our behaviour is unique. But the crux of it is that behaviour is a choice. So every person makes a conscious choice to behave in a certain way. So whereas some of the other tools kind of almost can sometimes categorize you into a certain behavioral profile, we actually believe that behavior is a choice and you make a conscious decision, even though you may prefer to operate in a certain way. So why is it important to understand your code or maybe the code of other people? Well, I think there's two reasons. So one, it introduces a really powerful language to be able to talk about behaviors. You know, sometimes talking about behaviors is a bit of a taboo subject. It can be quite difficult to engage someone on that conversation, particularly if the person you want to speak to about the behaviors is what you're perceiving as not the best. So they're being demanding or they're being bossy or pushy. Now, how great would it be if instead of labeling someone as bossy, you could reframe that and think they're just trying to get the job done? How different a conversation would that be if you had that really small reframe? But the other great benefit of understanding code is it just creates a better awareness of behaviors on every angle. So if you understand your own behavior a little bit better and what is driving it, and then you understand what is driving other people's behavior better, then you can make small changes to get better outcomes. So I don't know if anyone has ever heard this, but I was certainly told it when I was a kid. But my mum always used to say, treat people how you want to be treated. You know, does anyone else hear that from whoever brought them up? You know, and it's a really interesting statement because if we understand code correctly, every person is unique. We all have different things that drive our behaviors and different ways in which we interact with the world. So by treating somebody how you want to be treated isn't necessarily going to get the best reaction from them. We should maybe be treating people how they want to be treated, and we can only do that if we understand their behaviors better. So in summary, our teamship section is all about how do we create that harmony of a team? How do we create this murmuration of starlings, this flock that's moving in one rather than individuals? And we do that by understanding behaviors and working better as a team. But even if your team is working in harmony, what if they don't have the skills or the experience to deliver change? So I'm going to hand over to Rob now, who's going to talk us through the next section on skills and capability.
Thanks, Chris. So from my experience, there's 4 key groups whose skills and capabilities are going to have the biggest bearing on your change's chance of success. Those 4 groups are your sponsors, your project team members, your change champions, and your line managers. And conventional wisdom would dictate that you should outline roles and responsibilities just so everyone's really clear on what's required of them. And if you do that, you're on the path to a successful project. Now all you need to do is to ensure that they do what you've asked when you've asked it. Well, that only works if you've got an experienced team and everyone's done their job before. But that's not likely to be the case. So picture the scene. You've just been hired or even promoted to take the role of a sponsor on a huge transformation program. You're excited, you're eager, you really want to make that difference, but it's the biggest project you've ever led. And secretly inside, you're feeling that pressure, probably a bit of anxiety. You might be doubting your abilities, you might be doubting your knowledge. You might want to ask for help and support, but you probably won't. Why? Because you've just been promoted. You're supposed to know what you're doing, right? Now let's go back to Chris's marathon running. So he regularly ran 5 miles. He then decided to run a marathon. But he wouldn't just be able to do it overnight. He would set himself a plan, as he said, and he'd work, if he got out of bed, to increase his capability bit by bit. But more importantly, And what we wouldn't do at work is he'd reach out for that help. He'd ask others for hints and tips. He might join a running club, but he'd openly admit that he isn't quite there yet. But fear stops us doing that in work. And that fear truly cuts across our ability to embrace our learning path. And that's the thing that I want to change. So what do I do to attempt to break down that barrier, remove the stigma of needing the help? Well, I would provide a bespoke learning path for the key groups. So using seasons as a metaphor to describe the difference in mindset and activity that you need to do through the different phases of a change. So what would the seasons be? Well, think of spring like the initiation. You're wanting to bring your change to life. You're creating vision, providing clarity. You're engaging your allies for the road ahead. In the summer, you're designing the change. You're starting to see it grow. Your focus is turning to analysis and detail, making sure the solution's right. In autumn, you're delivering it. Your focus is on delivery, urgency, meeting the timescales, making sure everything's right. And then finally in winter, after you've implemented the change, you're embedding and closing out the project. This is when the going gets tough, when your change will need the protection more than ever. It's the most dangerous time for a change because you can't fully control it. It's not your change anymore. But if you can survive that first winter, you've got a great chance of realizing the benefits that you set out to get in the first instance. But what would a learning path include? Sounds very grandiose. It really isn't. It's broken down into two things. The first one is mindset. So like Chris said, I'd use codes early on to help get the team to recognize their preferences and others, to help adapt their ways of working. All of that to try and ease through the difficult times of agreeing a solution. I then probably look to build up communication skills within the team to help get them confident in delivering our message out to our customers, whether they're internal or external. As we progress through the delivery in autumn, I'd focus on objection handling and resilience. Because when the tire hits the road and that change lands, there is going to be tough conversations. There are going to be some people you're going to have to take from being detractors to promoters, if not passive, and their outlook to your change. But mindset is only one side of that coin for me. The other is practical. That's where I typically share with the teams the framework and the methodology that we're going to use throughout the change. But this isn't your bland Prince 2 methodology where you're in a straitjacket filling out documents. It's about how you practically do what is required. And having this clarity really helps those that haven't done it before to understand not only what they should do, but why. Why are we doing what we're doing and doing it in that way? If they can understand it, they're far more likely to help realize the benefit you're looking to. I tend to build this capability through tutorial videos or how-to guides or coaching. I genuinely believe that this investment is worth its weight in gold, but unfortunately it's overlooked. Because as our stories show previously, we invest in our technology and other things like that. But it's so powerful when you're equipping those that you're relying on to deliver the change to get there far more effectively. So the question I'd like you to reflect on is this. Are you investing enough in your team to deliver your business critical changes so that you'll be able to deliver what you need as quickly and effectively as possible? And if not, what is the potential impact on your business? Are you the next Netflix or are you the next Blockbuster? So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Chris, who's going to talk through resistance to change and how you can bring people who are receiving it on the journey.
Okay, we're on the final bit, the home straight now, so not much longer to go. So I'm going to talk about resistance to change, and this is almost around a number of practical tips that we can give on things that you can implement quite quickly and quite straight away to make a big impact on how change is received through the people who are being put through the change. So we usually use this kind of model. So there are 4 key components to managing resistance. So number 1, create a vision, a compelling vision, communicate clearly to everybody, engage with people and help them learn, And then around all of that is a whole set of activity to embed the change. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what embedding actually means to us. So starting with creating a compelling vision. So mobilizing commitment from a workforce is absolutely key to delivering a successful change. You know, if we are doing a big system change or a big process change, you know, landing the actual new system or the new process isn't the change being successful. What is successful is that people embrace it and adapt to it and use it, and it becomes the new norm. And creating a compelling vision is a great way to help people along that journey. So what is a vision? So it's a visual depiction of the things that have happened in the past, that are happening right now, and will happen in the future. And how do you even go about creating something like this? Well, it's really easy. You just start speaking to people. So, you know, we've done so many of these big pictures with organizations, and it all starts with a conversation. So having one-to-one conversations with people, running focus groups, doing surveys maybe, ultimately to elicit all of the rich stories from people on what has made an impact to them. You know, it could be things that have impacted them in a good way, things that have impacted them in a bad way, but ultimately they mean something to them. So it's the good, the bad, the ugly. And why are we doing this? It's ultimately so that we can tell that story to people and they can then feel part of the story because it becomes their story. It's there. If they can see on this picture that there are things that personally mean something to them, it makes them feel engaged. It's their picture, and they then start beginning to help drive forward that future aspiration. So creating that compelling vision is our tip number one. Tip number two is all about communicating clearly. So it might seem really common sense for me to say, when you're going through a big change and a big transformation, make sure you communicate. But you would be surprised at how many times I see communication lacking in these programs, because it's quite difficult to communicate. These programs, big transformation, you don't know all the answers. You know, a lot of the time you're working on developing the solution right up until the point where you're ready to go live. You know, there are so many things that need to be answered. And when you're in that state where there's so many moving parts, it's quite difficult to actually tell people the story, because if you don't have all the answers, then what do you say? So it's quite easy to go down the safe route and think, I'm just not going to communicate because I don't know exactly what to tell people. But here's the thing, if you don't tell the story, people will create their own. And I guarantee that the story that will organically grow in an organization is not going to be the story that you would want to be told. So top tips here are control the narrative. So if you are running a 12-month program of transformation, for example, each month, there should be an overarching story for that transformation, but each month might have its own narrative. So in month one, for example, if your objective is that you want to raise awareness of the change, all of your communications and the stories that you push out there would be about the rationale for change and why you're even doing it in the first place. So having that clear narrative throughout the journey of the change makes it easy to communicate and builds a coherent story. Number two is that we would recommend that you segment your audiences. And by segmenting, sounds like a little bit of a fancy word, but all it means is you're grouping together people who have similar characteristics, and then you're able to communicate with them through a means of communication that they'll be receptive to. So let's say, for example, you're an organization that has a manufacturing plant or a warehouse or distribution center, or any kind of operation where people don't typically sit at a desk and use a PC with email, etc. Well, in those areas, the likelihood that someone is going to be receiving and reading a digital newsletter is really slim. So you might want to think about, once you understand who your segments are, how do you engage with them on a way that they want to be engaged on? So in those areas, it might be things like face-to-face briefings or posters or whatever will work best for them. And tip number three is a comms plan. Now, again, this might sound like common sense, But a comms plan is so important to making sure that the story that is told throughout a change is on point and always links back to the narrative. So a big comms campaign can have so many moving parts, so many different channels, whether it's digital, paper, social, briefings, all these different things need to be planned and coordinated. So those 3 simple steps can help with communication. The next tip is all about engaging with people. So throughout a big transformation, you're always going to come up against resistance because not everybody is going to be personally benefiting from a change. Sometimes it might be shrinking department sizes. Sometimes people's roles may change in different ways. So people may almost fear that change because sometimes they don't know what's going to happen, or they may actually be negatively impacted. But your role isn't to actually win over every single person. That's the utopia. Of course, if we could get there, that'd be brilliant, but that's just not realistic. The role of a change manager within a transformation is just to tip that balance and to make sure enough people are engaged and enough people are kind of supporting the change that it becomes a success. So top tips for engagement: stakeholder mapping. Sounds really simple, but really just consider who out there in the organization has a potential to have a negative reaction to it. So looking at things like who is impacted the most by the process, who's going to be impacted by a reorganization. All these things should enable you to easily identify people that may personally be impacted. And then you can start engaging with them, talking to them, empathizing with them, helping them understand the change in a little bit more detail. The second tip is forum analysis. So most organizations have a typical cadence of meetings. It might be an all-company briefing, it might be departmental meetings, it might be team meetings. Each company is different. And mapping out all of those different opportunities is key to being able to secure airtime in them, and therefore being able to tell the narrative and tell the story to engage people on a face-to-face personal level. And the tip 3 within the engagement space is, again, a plan. In the same way as a comms plan, we need an engagement plan to say who's going to be doing what forums are we going to attend, what stakeholders are we going to engage with, who's going to do the talking, who's going to build the story, the slides. All that needs to be planned out and considered in the same way as any kind of project would be. Moving on, so helping people to learn. So I'm sure everyone has heard the phrase, you can take a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. And that absolutely applies to transformation. So on the screen, you'll see that there's 2 things there, technical versus mindset. The point I'm trying to make here is that I see so often organizations investing a lot in technical training. So if a new system's being launched, there will be amazing user guides, there'll be interactive videos, there'll be training sessions held to help people understand the nuts and bolts of what to do with this new system. But what we usually see lacking is the interventions from a mindset perspective. Now, let me kind of paint another picture. Let's say, for example, you are really feeling really stressed at this moment in time. It might be that you've got a real big deadline and a piece of work that's stressing you out. It might be that you're maybe getting married soon and you're arranging the marriage, got a bridezilla on your hands maybe. It might be that maybe you've booked a holiday and COVID has interrupted, everything. So whatever is stressing you out, just picture that right now. And let's say you're also learning to speak French, and you've got a class this evening where you're gonna, go to the class and try and learn a bit more. Do you think in that class, in light of all this stress going on in your head, that you'll be able to give it 100% of your attention and you'll be able to focus on learning French? The likelihood is probably, it's not very likely, is it? Now, that same concept applies to people going through change. The change itself is stressful. It brings anxiety, it's unknowns. People can often get stressed out by it. So rather than investing all your time and effort in technical training, perhaps we could start looking at some mindset interventions too. So for example, if someone is going through a change and they're particularly impacted, it might be that we want to look at resilience training for them, to give them the skills and the capability to improve their mental resolve so that when they do go for their technical training, they're in a better state to absorb that information. Or it might be that we look at line managers, and rather than giving them just the technical skills to show their teams what to do, we give them the training and the capability to lead through change, which is very different to knowing what buttons to press. They need to inspire and motivate their people to come along the journey. And finally, before we wrap up this session, now I'll hand over to Rob to summarise. The final piece of the resistance, managing resistance, is embedding the change. And when I say embedding the change, a lot of people think big transformations end with the implementation of a change. So you've got a big system, right? We've launched it, done. That isn't the finish line. That's nowhere near the finish line. Your finish line is much further down the track. And the reason for that is because change isn't successful when you deliver the tool. Change is successful when people start using the tool, when that usage of the tool becomes norm. So always think about where that actual finish line is. And everything we've talked about previously, from communication to engagement, all those things need to continue past that perceived finish line until the new norm becomes around. Okay, so over to you, Rob, to wrap up the session. And looking at the clock, and we've got a minute left.
Cool, thanks for that, Chris. So before we finish, I'd just like to recap on some of the things that we've talked about today. So most organisations have access to the technologies, and they've certainly got the money to make their changes successful. However, if you tend to overly focus on the delivery of the technology and see that as your key differentiator between success and failure, you might not get there. As our stories have shown, whether it's Cuse in the 30s, Blockbuster or Kodak in the early noughties, or Netflix and more recently, and a more important factor, the one that has the biggest impact on your chance of success, is your people. So we've gone through 3 areas of focus that can help you on your own change journeys in this space: teamship, capability, and resistance even. So a teamship, seek to recognise and understand and even embrace the different perspectives in your team. And remember, you're judged by your behaviour, not your intentions. If you'd like to explore a bit more thinking in this space, I really recommend Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And if you're a geek like me, the manga version is bloody brilliant. The second thing, capability. No matter what role you play in a change, what is required of you will be different depending on the stage, or as we call it, the season of the change. Remember that asking for help is a strength and not a weakness. You really should view every day as a school day. Reading Jim Collins, as Good to Great, really helped me spark ideas in this space and to view that school day every day. And the third thing is resistance. You don't have to win over every heart and mind to make a change stick. You just need to emotionally and rationally engage enough people. Seek out resistance, help bring them into the light. And remember, taking the time to understand the environment you're delivering into, even if you've worked in it for years, will pay dividends. For an engaging way of adding or refreshing to your memory in this area, John Cotter's fable, Our Iceberg is Melting, is great, especially if you love penguins. So unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all your questions that you've raised today, but we will come back to you individually throughout the week. And if you'd like to chat through any of the topics we've discussed, please do reach out to Chris or I through LinkedIn or visit our website, curiumsolutions.com. We hope you've enjoyed your session and have a great Birmingham Tech Week all. Cheers.